Good morning and welcome back to the lecture series on refugee migration diaspora. So, today we are going to discuss a new novel titled East West. So, East West is written by Sunil Ganguly, who was an Indian poet, novelist, short story writer, historian, and critic in the Bengali language. Ganguly is originally from East Bengal, which is now called Bangladesh, and he had witnessed major historical events in South Asia, partition of India, which happened in 1947, as well as the Liberation War or Mukti Juddha, which happened in 1971. And all these watershed events deeply affected and resonated in his writings. They deeply affected him and they resonated in his writings. So, East West or East and West by Sunil Ganguly centers on the theme of partition and the immigration of Bengali refugees to West Bengal. And so, Purva Paschim, its original name in Bengali, is considered as a seminal novel that depicts the post partition scenario, the post partition crisis in Bengal among the Bengalis. This novel is a record of the disturbed times in East Pakistan as well as in the Indian part of Bengal, which is known as West Bengal. Sunil Ganguly's Purva Paschim or East West has been translated into English by Enakshi Chatterjee. This novel, with its two expansive parts, is a monumental study of displacement and relocation against the backdrop of the Great Divide or partition. Based on the partition as a crucial moment in South Asian history, East West focuses on the conceptualization of refugee identity as well as deals with the problems of class conflict, diaspora, communal relations, and repatriation or resettlement. Sunil Ganguly was one of the foremost poets who experimented with new forms, themes, rhythms, and words in Bengali poetry in the 1950s and 1960s decades. He is best known for his novels Aranye Din Ratri, Shei Shomoy, Prothom Alo, and Purva Paschim. So, all these novels are originally written in the Bengali language. In 1985, he received the prestigious Sahitya Academy Award for his historical fiction Shei Shomoy, which is translated to English as Those Days. East West remains a highly acclaimed work of Bengali literature for its skillful depiction of the middle class Bengalis' reaction, especially the migrant section's reaction to the watershed of partition across time and boundaries. The novel brought Bengali literature to an unprecedented interface with history with its simple depiction of life, and it took Bengali literature to a remarkable height in historical fiction. The novel East West begins with a section titled The Beginning, which is almost reminiscent of Lewis Carroll's Begin at the Beginning and Go On Until You Come to the End, thereby drawing attention to the fact that it is a sequential narrative of events. In East West, the concept of home becomes a predominant factor and it is consistently foregrounded, especially using the trope of the refugees from East Bengal. The character of Pratap, who is also the protagonist, one of the central characters, sees his sister's house being taken over by a horde of refugees. These refugees would be commonly called squatters, who occupied empty houses, empty lands in the host land of West Bengal through the process of Jabardakhal, also known as forceful occupation in English. And so the squatters would squat on unclaimed lands which would essentially belong to the government, or sometimes they could also be wastelands. And then the squatter refugees would claim these lands, occupy these lands forcefully and build their own homes on these lands. This process would be known as Jabardakhal or forceful occupation. Pratap's own brother-in-law dies in the resulting scuffle and clash with the refugees. So, even after this event, Pratap is not able to bring himself to condemn the refugees. Later in the novel, he says, are they, referring to his own family, to himself, are they not refugees themselves, the landed gentry who have migrated from East Bengal and must now lead impoverished lives in the host land of West Bengal? So, the theme of impoverishment, displacement, and disposition, all these themes become central factors that propel the narrative forward. In East West, Pratap's pride is constantly hurt by the economic sanctions, the economic cuts that his family is forced to make. He dislikes having to buy fish that is cheap. The fact that he cannot provide nutritious food for his growing children becomes a source of frustration for him, because this, section of Bengali refugees, they have led a very good, a very wholesome life back in East Bengal before the partition. They have experienced a very wholesome life before the partition. They were used to a very lavish lifestyle, and so having to make this kinds of cut, having to live with so much of concessions, really hurts the protagonist. So Pratap is constantly annoyed at having to cut corners in his living. Another character, Bishwanath, in East West, shuns money and materiality. We see that he shuns money and materiality at the beginning of the novel. He never likes to talk of money the first thing in the morning. According to Bishwanath, one should worry about money only when one runs short. However, in the later part of the novel, this same Bishwanath is reduced to a man who is willing to do anything whatsoever for a mere day-to-day survival. In each of the character, especially Pratap, who is the image of the perfect Bengali Bhadralok, there are traces of extreme class consciousness. For instance, when the character of Kanu wishes to begin a business for himself, Pratap attempts to stop him, prevent him, because business is considered, as something pejorative. Business was a term associated pejoratively in the middle class Bengali mind, which is also a kind of narrowness that the author is criticizing. The author is questioning this kind of narrow-mindedness akin to the Bengali Bhadralok, the middle class sections from the Bengali populace. So, in these kinds of conceptualizations, one sees not only the inherent class consciousness of the East Bengali Bhadralok in this novel, but also the consistent cultural differences and resultant clashes and conflicts happening between the East Bengali migrants and the native West Bengalis. So, although they are co-religionists, they are mostly all of them Hindus and they speak the same language, we see that so while both the East Bengalis and the West Bengalis are co-religionists and they speak the same language, there is constantly and frequently a clash at the level of culture, at the level of one's sense of belonging to and attachment to a homeland, what one considers as a homeland. So, the Bhadralok East Bengali, mostly educated and well-heeled government job holders, comprised the service class population, and they had this contempt and stereotypical understanding of the business class. They would also frequently stay away from the people from other provinces. So, Bengalis right from after the partition had the tendency to avoid the people of other provinces. In this, the author is criticizing not just the inherent class consciousness of the Bengali Bhadralok, but also their parochial, narrow attitude. On the other hand, another character from the novel named Umapati, who is presumably a native from West Bengal, also has very negative stereotypical understanding about the refugees, about the East Bengali migrants. So Umapati thinks that East Bengal is a muddy and marshy land with the smell of fish everywhere, where the people speak in an uncivilized tongue. So they have, so the West Bengalis also have their own lens through which to see the migrants. They feel that they are uncouth, they are rustic, and they don't speak a civilized tongue. Their accent is actually very rustic. So the novel deals with a number of paradoxes, and it clearly demarcates the East Bengalis from the West Bengalis in terms of the culture that they possess. And yet, the novel underlines the common Bengali sentiment reigning at that point in time after the partition of India. Pippa Veddi, who is a scholar, notes that at the time of partition, the state mechanisms were not prepared for the mass exodus, the mass migration, which resulted in 12 to 14 million people being uprooted and displaced. When we move away from the official responses to partition and migration, we begin to see the differential experiences of the refugees also. So the experiences of the refugees have never been uniform. While the state directed some of the refugees, others made their own plans. So for some refugees, the state, the nation state would take the decision, whereas for the elite sections, they could make their own plans. They were the choosers. So utilizing personal networks, the refugees with better economic and socio-cultural resources were able to migrate to places which had an element of familiarity in the form of family, friends, and business as well as professional links. So the elite sections would even have, their connections, their networking across the border, and so they could resettle in a more organized, in a smoother fashion. From being refugees to becoming citizens is therefore a journey marked by one's distance from the camp life. Camp life is something that the government is sponsoring. So if one has to stay in government sponsored camp life, it means that one is poor, one is not self-dependent. It reflects one's impoverished status. So there were essentially two types of government housing facilities. One was the self-supported and the other was state-supported. It was an administrative filter to separate the resource-rich immigrants from the mass of impoverished refugees. The refugee as a category is essentially the able-bodied male. Women, disabled people, the juveniles, the infirm people were all on the fringes, on the peripheries of the rehabilitation process, as the latter, anyone that is not a young male, would need state sponsorship, would need state incentives in order to establish themselves. So the resettlement policies were largely tailored to meet the needs of the ideal refugee type, and this ideal refugee is a strong-bodied and able-bodied young male. Consequently, the meaning of a potential ideal citizen hinged on the question of gender. It emerged that the male would be the actor. The male members would eventually be the actors in the nation building project, and everyone else would remain in the fringes. Unattached widows and women who had their husbands, their male folks dying during partition, during riots, during displacement, and then grown up girls coming to India for marriage or to join their husbands, orphans who had no guardians alive. All these people would comprise a populace that would be treated with a sense of paternalism and control by the governments, because so they were treated as helpless beneficiaries of a welfareist state. The ideal refugee that represented the category of refugee itself comprised government officers, traders, businessmen, and other white collar job holders. So these people from these sections of society that immigrated to India after the partition were considered as assets. They were economically more secure, politically aware, and they were entrenched with social networking. Ravinder Kaur notes that the rich refugees' rhetoric of loss and fall of status accentuate the riches they owned. Self rehabilitation was not only a display of initiative and hard work for all refugees, but at the same time, it was also an expression of one's wealth and status in the past and a way of commanding authority in the new host land. So, the refugee card was a dual symbol of helplessness, dependence, as well as concessions and resources from the state. The significance of a refugee card was never the same for the Dalit grassroots section and the elite section. Some elites who had very easily and very quickly transcended their refuginess would render this card as defunct. They would not even use that card for any quota, for any help from the government. For the elite section, the refugee card or the refugee slip only had a historical value. They were ashamed of showing it publicly to others. The refugee card was an uncomfortable reminder of an inglorious past. Its absence would signify a family's successful self rehabilitation. On the contrary, those who failed to successfully establish themselves in the host country and in the host land would still retain this card. For the less socioeconomically established sections, therefore, the refugee card, would provide special benefits, including special quota for education and jobs. So, historian and scholar Hemanti Roy notes that although citizenship was the end goal for the government of India and the refugees retained their refugee identity as a political choice in many cases. And this retention of the refugee identity provided a concrete platform to articulate and negotiate demands for socio-economic integration. And this is true mainly for the section that depended on government doles, on government support. So, we see that while one section wants to readily forget about its refugee past and move on, the struggling part of the society, the struggling masses, the struggling class of people who comprise the refugee population really wanted to retain this identity in order to negotiate certain demands from the nation state. So, refugee as a term has been consistently seen as abominable, implying that the migrants were strangers whose resettlement and access to resources and benefits mostly depended on the benevolence of the host land of the Indian people. So, there was an argument to use the word Pravashi instead of refugee. So, Pravashi would be a relatively more positive term, which means exiled. So, Pravashi means someone in exile, because the partition had exiled a section of people who were originally a part of the undivided India. In the case of Bengal, we see that post 1950, the displaced person had a fixed definition. So, displaced person became a category which would be defined as follows: someone that had arrived on account of communal disturbances post 1st October 1946 and before 31st December 1950. So, there was a temporal boundary that had been set. After 1st October 1946 and before 31st December 1950, all the people that had immigrated to India would be considered as displaced person. that had immigrated to the Indian part of Bengal, the West Bengal, would be considered as displaced person. Further, according to this definition of displaced person, such an individual should have no land in West Bengal from before, and he or she should not intend to return to East Bengal. It pointed to the fact that the displaced person should have political and not economic incentive to migrate to West Bengal from East Pakistan. In 1956, the Indian government introduced the migration certificate in order to control refugees by regulating it as authorized migration. This decision was influenced by the fact that no relief or rehabilitation would be given to people infiltrating in India after 31st March 1958. Post 1958, the Indian state adopted the policy of no longer recognizing a new immigrant as refugee. A refugee's citizenship status was determined by his proof of victimhood, which meant that all poor refugees that could not self rehabilitate, that could not sponsor their own rehabilitation in the host land, would need to produce a genuine evidence of affliction in the homeland in the past in order to obtain financial support from government. In Bengal, where physical violence was comparatively less than in Punjab, migration of Bengali refugees who were not harmed but who anticipated harm and therefore moved to West Bengal was seen as a potential economic abuser. So, these Bengalis would be seen as potential economic abusers because they did not migrate to India owing to some real, so-called real crisis. They only anticipated harm and therefore traveled to India. As a way of defending the rights of the Bengali refugees, organizations such as United Central Refugee Council, UCRC, voiced the refugees' demands, and UCRC claimed that the distinction between political and economic migrants should not be made. I would like to stop my lecture here today and let's continue with our discussion on Sunil Ganguly's East-West in our next lecture. Thank you.